Troy, 1200 BC. A single golden apple, inscribed with 3 words that would ignite the ancient world's most devastating war. But the true betrayal began not on a battlefield, but in a palace chamber, where a Spartan queen looked into the eyes of a Trojan prince and chose love over loyalty. What Helen of Troy sacrificed for passion would cost 2 civilizations everything they held sacred. This is not just a story of beauty that launched 1,000 ships. This is the tale of a woman trapped between duty and desire, of a prince who risked everything for love, and of 2 empires that paid the ultimate price for one forbidden romance. In an age when marriage was diplomacy and queens were prizes to be won, Helen's choice would rewrite the rules of power, honor, and war itself. The golden apple that started it all was no myth. It was a symbol of divine judgment, crafted by hands that understood the weight of beauty in a world where kings killed for less. But Helen's true rebellion was not accepting Paris's gift. It was believing, for one dangerous moment, that she deserved to choose her own fate. That moment of hope would echo across centuries, inspiring poets and terrifying rulers who understood that sometimes love really can conquer kingdoms. In the Bronze Age world of 1200 BC, the Mediterranean Sea was not just water. It was a highway of power, carrying ships loaded with gold, slaves, and marriage contracts that decided the fate of nations. The Greek city-states existed in a delicate balance of alliance and rivalry, held together by oaths sworn on sacred objects and sealed with royal blood. Marriage between noble houses was the primary tool of diplomacy, and a queen's loyalty was worth more than any army. Helen, daughter of Zeus according to legend, but very much a mortal woman in her daily struggles, ruled beside Menelaus of Sparta not by choice, but by her father's careful political calculation. King Tyndareus had orchestrated her marriage like a master chess player, using her legendary beauty to forge the most important alliance in Greek history. When every eligible prince in Greece had competed for her hand, her father had demanded they all swear the Oath of Tyndareus, a sacred vow to defend whoever won her, creating a web of obligation that bound the fractured Greek world together. Their palace overlooked the Mediterranean from Sparta's hills, its walls decorated with frescoes depicting Greek victories over foreign enemies. Here, tribute arrived from conquered cities, ambassadors negotiated trade agreements, and Helen herself served as a living symbol of Greek unity. Her daily life was carefully choreographed political theater, every gesture watched and interpreted by those who understood that a queen's smile could mean the difference between peace and war. But across that same wine-dark sea, beyond the Aegean's scattered islands and the dangerous straits that guarded the route to the Black Sea's riches, lay Troy. The great city commanded the entrance to Asia, its massive walls protecting not just King Priam's family, but the gateway to trade routes that made kingdoms rich or starved them into submission. Prince Paris, second son of this mighty house, lived under his own burden of royal expectations, trained from childhood to serve Troy's interests above his own desires. Neither he nor Helen yet understood that their names would become synonymous with the price of choosing love over duty, or that their story would be told long after their cities had crumbled to dust. Helen's days began in darkness, before the first cock crowed in Sparta's lower city. She would rise from her bed of Lebanese cedar, carved with symbols of protection and inlaid with ivory scenes of Artemis the huntress. The bed itself was a wedding, gift from her father, a reminder that even her rest was political. Egyptian linen sheets, finer than anything produced in Greece, whispered against her skin as she moved. Another symbol of the trade relationships her marriage secured. Her enslaved women, captured from cities that had defied Spartan expansion, would enter silently to begin the ritual of transformation from woman to queen. Each had been chosen not just for skill, but for beauty that would reflect well on their mistress without competing with it. They spoke little, these women whose own stories of love and loss had been cut short by Greek spears, but their gentle hands knew every detail of what was required. The peplos they wrapped around Helen's body each morning was woven from wool dyed with murex shells, the purple so deep it appeared almost black until light struck it directly. Gold clasps held the garment in place, each one hammered by Spartan, craftsmen into the shape of a lion, Menelaus's symbol, marking her as his possession even as they elevated her status. Around her waist went a belt of gold links, and at her throat, always, the locket her mother had given her on her wedding day. The morning ritual culminated in the great hall, where Helen would take her place on a throne carved from a single piece of marble. Here, merchants would present their finest goods for royal inspection. Ambassadors would deliver messages from distant kings, and local nobles would seek audience for disputes that required the queen's judgment. Helen had learned to read faces, as carefully as any scribe read tablets, to see the calculation behind every smile, the fear beneath every bow, the hope that flickered in the eyes of those who believed royal favor might change their fate. But this particular spring carried whispers that made even the most composed courtiers lean forward with interest. Ships bearing Troy's royal banner had been spotted moving between the Greek islands, their purple sails and golden figureheads announcing a diplomatic mission of unusual importance. Prince Paris, they said, was personally leading a delegation to renew trade agreements and perhaps forge new alliances between Troy and the Greek cities. The servants' quarters buzzed with rumors about this Trojan prince. He was young, unmarried, and blessed with beauty that rivaled even Helen's own. A dangerous combination in a world where royal marriages were the currency of peace. Some claimed he was Aphrodite's favorite, protected by the goddess of love in all his endeavors. Others whispered that he had been raised not just as a warrior, but as a poet and diplomat, educated in the arts of persuasion that made men and women alike eager to please him. Helen listened to these whispers, while her fingers worked patterns into the fabric stretched across her loom. Each thread represented a choice, she had learned. Pull too tight, and the weave would pucker. Too loose, and it would sag. The delicate balance required constant attention, like the political alliances her marriage represented. But lately, as she worked the familiar patterns of Greek victories and Spartan glory, she found herself imagining what it would be like to weave something entirely new. When Menelaus entered her chambers that evening, his scarred hands bearing wine mixed with honey, Helen studied his face in the flickering oil lamplight. Her husband was not a cruel man, but he was a careful one, calculating advantage in every situation. His weathered features told the story of battles fought for Sparta's glory. But his eyes, she realized, had never shown the kind of fire she sometimes glimpsed in her own reflection. "Troy's prince has accepted our invitation," Menelaus announced, settling onto the low couch beside her loom. "He'll arrive within the week, bringing gifts from King Priam and proposals for expanding our trade agreements." He paused, studying Helen's face with the same attention he gave to military maps. "You'll play your part, of course. Show him Spartan hospitality. Demonstrate the unity of our house. These Trojans respect strength, but they appreciate beauty even more." Helen nodded, her fingers never pausing in their weaving. "Of course, my lord. I'll ensure he understands the value of Sparta's friendship." But as she spoke, her hand moved unconsciously to the golden locket at her throat, and for the first time in years, she wondered what choices might be written in the threads of her own fate. The next morning brought runners with more detailed news. Paris of Troy had been sighted just beyond the harbor, his ship resplendent with silk banners, and accompanied by a small fleet of vessels loaded with gifts. Helen stood at her window, watching the distant specks on the horizon grow larger, and felt something stir in her chest that she had not experienced since her wedding day. The flutter of possibility, dangerous and sweet as honey mixed with wine. Paris arrived with the sunset, his ship's purple sails catching the last golden light as it entered Sparta's harbor like a vision from the realm of the gods. Helen watched from the palace's highest balcony as the Trojan prince stepped onto Greek soil, and even at that distance, she could see why palace servants had spent days whispering about his legendary beauty. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had never known defeat, never bent his knee to anyone but his father, his dark hair bound with a circlet of silver that caught the dying light like captured starfire. The welcoming procession wound through Sparta's streets as torches were lit against the gathering dusk. Paris rode in a chariot of polished bronze, acknowledging the curious crowds with gestures that seemed both royal and genuinely warm. Behind him came his retinue, young Trojan nobles whose rich clothes and easy confidence spoke of a city that had never fallen, never known siege. never doubted its own invincibility. They brought gifts that would have impressed any Greek court. Bolts of silk that shimmered like water, jewels from distant lands, and weapons forged by smiths whose secrets were older than Troy's walls. That first evening's feast was a masterpiece of diplomatic theater, every detail choreographed to demonstrate Sparta's power while honoring their distinguished guest. The great hall blazed with bronze mirrors that reflected torchlight until the very air seemed to dance with gold. Helen wore her finest peplos, the one reserved for the most important occasions, its deep purple fabric adorned with gold thread that traced patterns of victory and prosperity across the silk. Menelaus and Paris exchanged gifts with the formal courtesy of kings. A golden cup engraved with scenes of Sparta's greatest victories, a sword with a handle carved from Trojan ivory, and set with gems that caught the light like fallen stars. They spoke of trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world, of mutual protection against the barbarian tribes that threatened civilization, of the delicate balance of power that kept their peoples prosperous and secure. Helen sat beside her husband throughout the lengthy ceremonies, pouring wine from amphoras painted with scenes of divine favor, offering the ritual words of welcome that transformed Paris from stranger to honored guest. Her role was precisely defined. She was the jewel in Sparta's crown, proof of the city's prosperity and divine blessing. But when Paris's eyes met hers across the flickering torches and golden vessels, she felt as though she were seeing color for the first time after years of gray shadows. Over the following days, a strange and dangerous dance began. Paris proved himself the perfect guest, respectful to Menelaus without being servile, courteous to the household without overstepping boundaries, generous with gifts for everyone from stable boys to senior advisors. He possessed that rarest of diplomatic skills, the ability to make each person feel uniquely valued while never compromising his own dignity. But Helen began to notice patterns that sent her heart racing despite her careful royal composure. Paris would appear in the palace gardens precisely when she walked there at dawn, claiming to admire the roses that bloomed against the eastern wall. His conversations with Menelaus about military tactics and trade negotiations seemed to stretch, longer whenever she passed through the Great Hall, as though her presence added weight to diplomatic discussions. He would find subtle reasons to ask her about Spartan customs, the meanings of local festivals, the proper pronunciation of words in her dialect, questions that required her to speak directly to him, their eyes meeting as she explained the intricacies of her homeland. The palace's rhythm changed with his presence. Servants moved with extra care, knowing that foreign eyes were watching and judging. The evening meals became elaborate performances, with musicians and dancers brought in to entertain their distinguished guest. Helen found herself dressing with unusual attention to detail, choosing jewelry that caught the light, braiding her hair in styles that had been admired by poets. She told herself this was simply proper hospitality, but her heart knew better. The most dangerous moment came during the festival of Artemis, when all of Sparta gathered to honor the virgin goddess of the hunt. Helen, as queen, led the procession of noble women through the city streets to the sacred grove, where the goddess's ancient shrine stood surrounded by cypress trees. She wore white robes for the ceremony, her only ornament a crown of silver leaves, and carried offerings of silver arrows crafted by the city's finest smiths. Paris had requested permission to observe the ceremony, claiming scholarly interest in Greek religious practices. Such curiosity was common among foreign dignitaries, and Menelaus had readily agreed. As Helen knelt before Artemis's marble statue, speaking the ancient prayers for protection and wisdom that had been recited in this place for generations, she could feel eyes upon her that belonged neither to the goddess nor to her husband. The ritual prayers seemed to take forever, each word heavy with significance she had never fully understood until this moment. She asked Artemis for protection in the hunt, for wisdom and judgment, for strength to fulfill her duties as queen and wife. But beneath the formal words, her heart whispered different prayers, for understanding of the strange fire that had begun burning in her chest, for courage to face choices she did not yet fully comprehend, for forgiveness for thoughts that were becoming increasingly difficult to control. Later, as the celebration continued into evening with wine and music in the palace courtyard, Helen found herself seeking solitude away from the crowd. The spring air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of laughter from the feast. She walked alone in the palace's outer courtyard, between the columns painted with scenes of divine favor, trying to calm the racing of her heart. Paris appeared from the shadows between the pillars as though he had been waiting, as though he had known she would seek this quiet place. For a long moment they stood in silence, the space between them crackling with unspoken recognition. The distant sounds of celebration seemed to come from another world entirely. "In Troy," Paris said quietly, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as foreign, exotic, dangerous. "We have a saying, the gods write our names in starlight, but only we can choose which stars to follow." His eyes never left her face as he spoke, and Helen felt as though he were reading secrets written in her expression that she had not known she possessed. Helen's hand moved unconsciously to her golden locket, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it even over the distant music. The weight of the jewelry seemed suddenly unbearable, a chain that bound her to a life she had never chosen. Before she could find words to reply, footsteps echoed from the colonnade, sharp and purposeful against the marble. They stepped apart quickly, the spell broken by the approaching sound. Paris melted back into the shadows with the grace of a man accustomed to court intrigue, disappearing so completely that Helen almost wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. One of her attendants appeared, concern written across her weathered face, come to summon the queen back to her husband's side and the safety of her prescribed role. As Helen walked back toward the light and laughter of the feast, her fingers clutched the golden locket until its edges bit into her palm. She had felt, for just a moment, what it might be like to choose which stars to follow. The sensation was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. The ancient world held its breath as a Spartan queen stood at the crossroads between duty and desire. If you're captivated by this story of forbidden love that changed the course of history, please subscribe and hit the like button. We're about to witness the most dangerous night of Helen's life, the moment when she would be forced to choose between the crown she wore and the life she truly wanted. The decision she makes will echo through the centuries, inspiring poets and terrifying kings who understand that sometimes love really can topple empires. Don't miss what happens next. The message arrived at dawn on the 5th day of Paris's visit, delivered by a runner whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding. Menelaus read the clay tablet in his private chambers, while Helen watched his face grow grave with concern. King Idomeneus of Crete had sent urgent word. A boundary dispute with a neighboring island kingdom threatened to escalate into war, and as Crete's ally, Sparta was bound by treaty to provide immediate assistance. "The matter cannot wait," Menelaus explained to Helen, as she helped him pack his traveling clothes into leather chests, reinforced with bronze fittings. His scarred hands moved efficiently through the familiar ritual of preparing for campaign, selecting weapons and gathering the personal items that reminded a king of home during long absences. Idomeneus's message suggests Mycenaean raiders are involved. If we don't act quickly, the conflict could spread to every island in the eastern Mediterranean. Helen nodded with appropriate wifely concern, folding his cloaks with the practiced care of a woman who had watched her husband depart for war too many times to count. But beneath her composed exterior, her heart raced with a mixture of fear and possibility that made her hands tremble slightly as she worked. "How long will you be away, my lord?" "A fortnight, perhaps 3 weeks if the negotiations prove difficult." Menelaus paused in his packing to study her face, his expression softening with genuine affection. Despite the political nature of their marriage, 10 years had bred a comfortable partnership between them, built on mutual respect and shared duty. Paris has been invited to extend his stay, to study our military training methods, and perhaps negotiate a formal alliance between Troy and the Greek cities. "You'll ensure he receives proper hospitality in my absence." Helen kissed her husband farewell at the palace gates, as his ship prepared to depart for Crete, her lips brushing his cheek with the cool affection of established habit. The entire court gathered to see their king off, a display of unity and strength designed to remind everyone, including their Trojan guest, that Sparta remained formidable even when its ruler traveled abroad. But as Menelaus's ship disappeared over the horizon, Helen felt the careful structure of her life begin to shift like sand beneath her feet. The palace felt different with Menelaus gone, quieter in some ways, but charged with an electricity that made the very air seem to hum with possibility. Helen tried to maintain her usual routines with extra precision, as though perfect adherence to protocol could protect her from the dangerous currents she sensed flowing beneath the surface of daily life. She met with the household stewards to review expenses, supervised the weaving women who created the textiles that would be traded for foreign luxuries, and made daily offerings at the palace shrine to ensure divine protection for her absent husband. But she found herself listening for Paris's voice in distant corridors, watching for his silhouette in doorways, her attention drawn to him like iron to lodestone. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, appearing at unexpected moments before vanishing again into the complex geography of the palace. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him in the training yards, watching Spartan warriors practice with weapons and tactics, his intelligent eyes absorbing details that might prove useful to Troy's military planners. Other times she would see him in deep conversation with merchants and craftsmen, asking detailed questions about trade routes and production methods. On the third evening of Menelaus's absence, Helen dismissed her attendants early and retreated to her private chambers, seeking solitude to calm her increasingly turbulent thoughts. She sat before her bronze mirror, slowly removing the golden ornaments that marked her status, the lion-headed pins, the chain of office, the elaborate earrings that caught torchlight like captured stars. Her reflection looked back at her with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger, a woman she had never been permitted to become. The soft knock at her door came so quietly she almost missed it over the sound of her own heartbeat. When she opened the carved wooden panel, she found not a servant with some household matter, but Paris himself. He stood in the shadowed corridor holding a small wooden box, his face grave with an expression that might have been sorrow or determination or both. "My lady," he said quietly, his voice carrying the formal respect required between guest and hostess, even as his eyes held promises that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol. "I bring a gift from my mother, Queen Hecuba, who wished to honor the Queen of Sparta with a token of Troy's friendship and admiration." Helen's hands trembled as she accepted the box. Acutely aware of the impropriety of receiving a male guest in her private chambers, while dressed in only her sleeping robes, the box was crafted from cedar wood and inlaid with precious metals that formed patterns of vines and flowers, beautiful enough to be a treasure in its own right. But when she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat at what lay within. 3 golden apples rested on silk the color of sunrise, each no larger than her palm, but worked with such intricate detail they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every leaf and curve rendered with perfection that spoke of master artisans working at the peak of their skill. But it was the inscriptions that made her heart stop. Tiny Greek letters engraved around each apple's circumference. "For the fairest, for the wisest, for the most beloved." "They were made by our finest craftsmen," Paris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Commissioned for a queen whose reputation for beauty and wisdom has reached even Troy's distant shores." But the words... He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the air between them seem to crackle. "Those were chosen by someone who has watched you these past days and seen not just a queen fulfilling her duties, but a woman whose inner light has been hidden beneath protocol and duty for far too long." The golden apples slipped from Helen's suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering across the marble floor with tiny musical sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the charged silence of the chamber. Each one caught the lamplight as it rolled, sending fragments of gold dancing across the painted walls like fallen stars seeking their way back to heaven. When Paris stepped forward to help gather the scattered treasures, their hands touched over the gleaming gold. Neither moved away. His fingers were warm against hers, calloused from sword training but gentle as though he were handling something infinitely precious. Helen felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble like sun-dried clay in a sudden storm. "I leave at dawn," Paris said, his voice rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. "My ship is loaded, my men ready to return to Troy with news of Sparta's strength and friendship. I ask nothing of you, Helen. Nothing that would compromise your honor or endanger your position. But I needed you to know that in Troy, there is a place where queens choose their own fate, where beauty like yours is honored not as a political asset, but as a gift from the gods themselves." Helen looked down at the golden apples gleaming on the floor between them. Each one a choice, each inscription a promise of a different life entirely. For the fairest spoke of a world where her beauty would be celebrated rather than calculated. For the wisest promised a place where her intelligence would be valued rather than merely displayed. For the most beloved whispered of a love that existed for its own sake, rather than as the foundation of a political alliance. When she lifted her eyes to Paris's face, she saw her own desperate longing reflected there. The hunger of two people who had spent their lives serving others' ambitions, suddenly confronted with the possibility of serving their own hearts instead. The golden locket at her throat seemed to burn against her skin, its familiar weight transformed into chains she had never chosen to wear. "What if?" Helen began, then stopped. The words too dangerous to speak aloud even in the privacy of her own chambers. But Paris understood. His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the scattered gold, and the warmth of his touch seemed to flow through her entire body like wine mixed with honey. "What if a queen chose to see Troy's ships from the inside?" she whispered finally, her voice so soft it barely disturbed the flame of the oil lamp beside her bed. What if she decided to discover for herself whether the stories of Troy's beauty matched the reality? The question hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Paris's eyes never left her face as he answered, his words carrying the weight of an oath sworn before the gods themselves. Then she would find herself welcomed not as a trophy or a political prize, but as a woman whose choice honored Troy more than any conquest could. The plan was born in whispers and crafted in shadows, each detail balanced on the razor's edge between hope and catastrophe. Helen spent the remaining hours of darkness moving through her chambers like a woman in a dream, selecting the few possessions she could not bear to leave behind. Her hands shook as she folded the golden apples into silk wrappings, their inscriptions now feeling like prophecies rather than mere decorations. The most difficult choice was her mother's locket. Queen Leda had given it to her on her wedding day, a blessing for protection in love and war that had become Helen's most precious possession. Inside the golden case, worn smooth by years of worried fingers, lay a tiny scroll with a prayer to Aphrodite written in her mother's careful hand. Taking it would mean carrying a piece of her old life into whatever came next. Leaving it would be like cutting the last thread that connected her to the woman she had been. In the end, she clasped the chain around her neck one final time, feeling the familiar weight settle against her collarbone like an anchor in a storm. Her most trusted attendant, Aethra, had served Helen since childhood, following her from her father's house to Sparta's royal palace. The older woman knew every secret Helen had ever harbored, every tear she had shed in private, every moment of joy that had flickered briefly before being smothered by duty. When Helen explained her plan, disguised as a desire to make dawn offerings at Artemis's harbor shrine for Menelaus's safe journey, Aethra's weathered face remained carefully composed, but her eyes reflected a lifetime of understanding. "The dark cloak, my lady?" Aethra asked quietly, her hands already moving toward the chest that held Helen's simplest garments. "The one you wore for your father's funeral?" Helen nodded, not trusting her voice. The cloak was woven from black wool, unremarkable enough to pass unnoticed in the pre-dawn darkness, but fine enough not to dishonor the goddess she claimed to visit. As Aethra helped her into the simple garment, Helen caught sight of herself in the bronze mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Stripped of her golden ornaments and royal peplos, she looked younger, more vulnerable, more human than she had in years. "Will you tell them?" Helen asked, as Aethra handed her the small traveling chest that would hold her few possessions. The question carried layers of meaning. Would she alert the guards, summon the household, raise the alarm that would bring Helen back before she could take the first step toward her new life? Aethra's hands stilled on the chest's bronze clasps, and for a moment, the years fell away. She was once again the young woman who had helped a frightened girl prepare for a wedding she had never wanted, who had held Helen while she wept for the childhood that ended the day her father chose her husband. "I will tell them that my lady sought the goddess's blessing for her husband's safe return," she said finally. "How long it takes the goddess to answer, that is not for servants to question." Helen kissed the older woman's cheek, tasting salt tears she had not realized were falling. Then she lifted her hood and stepped out into the corridor, leaving behind the chambers that had been both palace and prison for 10 years of her life. The palace at dawn was a different world, from the bustling hive of activity it became once the sun climbed higher. A few early servants moved through the corridors on quiet errands, but the great halls and audience chambers stood empty, their painted walls and golden decorations sleeping in the gray light that filtered through high windows. Helen's soft-soled sandals made no sound on the marble floors as she made her way toward the gates, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. The guards at the main entrance recognized her immediately, despite the simple cloak, and bowed respectfully as she explained her early devotions. Such piety was not unusual for royal women, and Helen's reputation for proper religious observance was well established. They offered an escort, but she declined with gracious thanks, explaining that the goddess preferred solitary prayer and that she would return before the household stirred for the day's business. The key path to Gythium harbor wound through olive groves and vineyards that supplied the royal table, past small shrines where local farmers left offerings for good harvests and protection from raiders. Helen had walked this route countless times during her years as queen, always accompanied by guards and attendants, always aware that her movements were watched and reported. Now, alone in the growing light of dawn, she felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more free than she had since childhood. Paris's ship waited at anchor beyond the harbor's mouth, its purple sails furled but ready for swift departure. In the gray light before sunrise, it looked like something from a dream, too beautiful and too dangerous to be entirely real. Smaller boats moved between the ship and shore, loading the last supplies for what the crew believed would be a routine return journey to Troy. When Helen appeared from the olive groves like a vision wrapped in morning mist, the Trojan sailors working on the beach stopped their activities and stared. They had heard the stories of her legendary beauty, but seeing her in person, stripped of royal regalia but somehow more radiant for its absence, left them speechless with awe and terror. They understood, in that moment, that they were witnessing history in the making. Paris himself came ashore in a small boat rowed by two of his most trusted men, his face grave with the magnitude of what they were attempting. There were no passionate declarations, no dramatic gestures, just two people who had chosen each other over duty, love over loyalty, stepping together across a threshold from which there could be no return. "Are you certain?" he asked as he helped her into the boat, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice. The question carried the weight of everything they were leaving behind. Her crown, his father's trust, the peace between their peoples, the lives that would be lost in the war. Their choice would inevitably bring. Helen looked back once at the harbor that had been the edge of her world for so long, then forward toward the ship that would carry her to whatever came next. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, and meant it. As the boat pulled away from Sparta's shore, Helen sat in the stern, watching her homeland shrink into the distance. The sun was rising now, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded her of the apples nestled in her traveling chest. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the harbor watchtowers, signal, fires lit by guards who had discovered the Queen's absence and were spreading word of the catastrophe that had befallen the royal house. But Paris sat beside her, his hand covering hers on the boat's wooden rail, and for the first time in her adult life, Helen felt like she was sailing toward freedom rather than away from it. The future stretched ahead like uncharted waters, dangerous and beautiful, and entirely her own choice. Whatever price others would pay for her decision, she had finally chosen which stars to follow. The ship's purple sails caught the morning wind as they cleared the harbor, carrying them east toward Troy and a destiny that would echo through the ages. The siege of Troy began 2 years later, when 1,000 black ships appeared on the Trojan horizon like a storm cloud made of wood and bronze and burning hatred. Helen watched their arrival from the highest tower of Troy's palace, her hands resting on stone battlements that had protected the city for generations beyond counting. The golden locket still hung at her throat, but the woman who wore it had been transformed by love and loss in equal measure. Those first months in Troy had been like living inside a dream painted with gold and purple silk. Paris had been everything Menelaus was not. Gentle where her first husband had been commanding, poetic where he had been practical, passionate where he had been dutiful. He would bring her flowers from the palace gardens at dawn, read her verses he had composed in her honor, dance with her on terraces overlooking. the city while musicians played melodies that made the very air seem to shimmer with joy. Queen Hecuba had welcomed her with genuine warmth, rather, than the calculating courtesy Helen had expected. The older woman understood, perhaps better than anyone, the burdens that came with royal beauty and the sacrifices required of queens who married for politics rather than love. "My son sees light in your eyes that I have not witnessed in his since he was a child," she told Helen one evening as they worked side by side at their looms. "That alone would make you precious to me, even if your wisdom and grace had not already won my affection." King Priam himself had declared that any woman beautiful enough to inspire such devotion must surely be blessed by the gods. He treated Helen not as a prize won through cunning, but as a daughter who had chosen to honor Troy with her presence. In council meetings, he asked for her opinions on matters of diplomacy and trade, having learned that her years as Sparta's queen had given her insights into Greek politics that proved invaluable in navigating the complex relationships between nations. For the first time in her adult life, Helen found herself not just loved, but truly cherished, free to speak her mind without fear of political consequences, to walk the palace gardens without guards shadowing her every step, to choose how she would spend her days based on her own desires rather than the demands of protocol. She learned to read Trojan poetry, studied the city's ancient history, even began composing verses of her own that celebrated the beauty of her new homeland. But freedom, Helen discovered, was not the same thing as peace. Even within Troy's massive walls, even surrounded by the strongest fortifications in the known world, she could feel the weight of what her choice had cost. Letters arrived regularly from Greek cities, each one listing the growing number of young men who had answered Menelaus's call to war. The Oath of Tyndareus that had once protected her marriage now guaranteed that every Greek king would march to reclaim her, their honor bound to a vow sworn in her father's hall years. Before she had ever seen Paris's face, spies and merchants brought increasingly dire reports from the enemy, camp that grew larger each month outside Troy's walls. Menelaus walked among his troops like a man carved from stone, his grief and rage transformed into an implacable hunger for vengeance that nothing could satisfy. Agamemnon, his brother, and the most powerful king in Greece, had seized upon Helen's flight as an excuse to launch the war he had long desired, a campaign that would make him emperor of the Mediterranean world. Helen would sometimes stand on the palace balconies at sunset, watching the distant campfires of the Greek army twinkle like fallen stars across the plain. Each light represented men who had left their homes, their wives, their children, to fight for the return of a woman who no longer wished to be returned. The knowledge was a weight that pressed against her heart with every breath, a guilt that no amount of love could entirely dispel. As the siege dragged into its 5th year, then its 7th, then its 10th, Helen aged in ways that had nothing to do with the passing seasons. Lines appeared around her eyes, not from laughter as they should have been, but from watching funeral pyres burn in both camps. Her hands, once soft from a life of royal ease, grew calloused from helping tend the wounded who filled Troy's streets. Her golden hair began to show threads of silver, and her famous beauty took on a quality that was somehow both more profound and more terrible than it had been in her youth. The war had changed Paris as well. The poetic prince who had wooed her with flowers and verses became a hardened warrior who spent his days on the city walls, fighting desperately to protect the woman he loved and the city that had sheltered them both. His hands, once gentle enough to weave garlands, now bore the permanent stains of sword oil and blood. But when he looked at Helen, his eyes still held the same wonder that had first drawn her to him, as though she remained a miracle he could scarcely believe was real. The end, when it finally came, arrived not through the gates that had withstood a decade of assault, but through Greek cunning and Trojan pride. Helen was among the first to see the massive wooden horse the Greeks had left behind after their apparent retreat, and something in her heart went cold as winter stone. She had lived in the world of royal politics long enough to recognize a trap when she saw one. No matter how beautiful its disguise, she begged Priam not to bring it inside the walls, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had watched kingdoms fall and rise on the strength of single decisions. She pleaded with Paris to burn it where it stood, to send it back to the sea as an offering to Poseidon, to do anything except allow it past the gates that had protected Troy for so long. But the city had grown weary of siege, and desperate for any sign that the war might finally be ending. When the horse was dragged through the gates in triumph, Helen closed her eyes and clutched her golden locket so tightly its edges cut into her palm. The night Troy fell, Helen stood in the highest tower of the burning palace, watching her second home die around her. Below, Greek soldiers poured through streets she had walked in happiness, bringing fire and sword to the city that had welcomed her with such generous hearts. The screams of the dying rose like smoke into the star-filled sky, and Helen understood that this was the true price of her choice. Not her own exile or disgrace, but the destruction of an entire civilization that had committed no crime except offering sanctuary to forbidden love. Paris found her there as the flames climbed higher, mortally wounded by a Greek arrow, but determined to spend his last moments at her side. His face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes still held the love that had started everything. "Was it worth it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the burning city. "All of this. Was our love worth the price?" Helen touched his face with trembling fingers, her tears falling like silver rain onto his chest. Around them, Troy died in fire and screams, but in that moment, she felt only the terrible clarity that comes at the end of all stories. "Ask me when the poets have finished telling our tale," she whispered back. "Ask me when the last song has been sung about the woman who chose love over duty, and see if the world remembers our choice as tragedy or triumph." Then the smoke swallowed them both, and the city that had sheltered their forbidden love became their funeral pyre, burning bright enough to be seen from every shore of the Mediterranean Sea. 3 centuries after Troy's fall, a merchant digging foundations for a warehouse near the ancient ruins found a small golden locket buried beneath layers of ash and broken stone. The piece was exquisite in its craftsmanship, worked with such skill that it seemed to glow in the Mediterranean sunlight despite its long burial. Inside, inscribed in letters so tiny they seemed written by divine hands, was a prayer to Aphrodite for protection in love and war. Words that had been whispered by desperate hearts for generations beyond counting. Scholars debated whether the locket had belonged to Helen, herself, or to one of her attendants, but all agreed on one remarkable detail. The gold bore no tarnish, despite centuries buried in earth that had seen the rise and fall of empires. Some claimed this was evidence of the gods' favor, proof that love blessed by Aphrodite could survive even the destruction of cities. Others argued it simply demonstrated the skill of Trojan craftsmen, whose techniques for working precious metals had died with their civilization. What happened to Helen after Troy's destruction remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, debated by chroniclers and poets with the passion usually reserved for matters of religion or politics. Some accounts claim that Menelaus forgave her when he found her in the burning palace, that their reunion was so moving even Greek soldiers wept to witness it. These versions insist she returned to Sparta, where she and her first husband lived out their remaining years in reconciled peace, their marriage strengthened by the trials that had nearly destroyed it. Other chroniclers tell darker tales. They claim Helen died in Troy's flames, choosing to perish with the city that had given her love, rather than return to a homeland that would forever see her as the cause of so much death. In these accounts, she becomes a figure of tragic nobility, a woman who paid the ultimate price for daring to choose her own fate in a world that demanded female submission to male authority. A few scattered sources whisper of a third possibility, that Helen escaped Troy's destruction entirely, aided by sympathetic Trojans who helped her flee to Egypt or Cyprus, where she began life anew under a different name. These stories paint her as a woman who refused to accept either victory or defeat, who carved out a third path between the choices others tried to force upon her. In these tales, she lives on as a symbol of female agency, in an age that rarely permitted such autonomy. The truth, like so much of Helen's story, exists somewhere in the space between legend and history, between the choices we make and the stories others tell about them. What remains certain is this: a woman once looked at the life she had been given and decided it was not enough. She chose love over duty, passion over security, freedom over safety, and in doing so, changed the course of civilizations. Whether that choice was heroic or tragic depends entirely on who tells the tale, and what they believe about the right of individuals to pursue happiness even when such pursuit carries a terrible price. The golden locket found in Troy's ruins was eventually donated to a temple of Aphrodite on the island of Cyprus, where it was displayed as a sacred relic alongside other artifacts from the Age of Heroes. Visitors would leave offerings of apple blossoms and honey, whispering prayers for lovers separated by duty, for marriages torn between passion and politics, for all those who must choose between the life they are given and the life they desire. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean world to see the locket and hear the stories associated with it. Young women facing unwanted marriages would touch the glass case and pray for Helen's courage. Wives trapped in loveless political alliances would light candles and ask for her strength. Even men would sometimes approach the shrine, seeking understanding of the force that could drive someone to risk everything for love. The inscription inside the locket remained perfectly legible across the centuries, as though the words were being constantly renewed by the prayers of those who needed their protection. "Grant protection in love and war," the tiny script read, "and let those who choose the path of the heart find the strength to pay whatever price their choice demands." But Helen's story was not the only royal love affair that toppled empires and rewrote the map of the ancient world. Next week, discover how Cleopatra's forbidden romance with Mark Antony led to the fall of both Egypt and Rome, and why their passionate love letters were considered so dangerous that Augustus himself ordered them burned. What secrets did those letters contain? And how did a queen and a general's private correspondence threaten to change the balance of power across 3 continents?